Good evening. It is good to be together this evening. We're going to be continuing for a brief time together tonight, talking about some of the things that we talked about this morning. This will hopefully be a shortened sermon since we're having our congregational meeting tonight. But we talked this morning about the heart behind self-defense. And honestly, I think that what we talked about this morning is a lot more important and foundational than the things that we're going to talk about tonight. Tonight we're going to explore some more principles and passages regarding when self-defense might be legitimate, but the most important thing is that we are approaching this with a heart that is the heart of Jesus, that prioritizes what God would have us prioritize, and that we're thinking about this in the right way. I think there's going to be some room for us in discernment and determination to draw some slightly different lines on what exact situation we think might warrant force, even deadly force, to be used in the defense of human life. But I think one thing that we can say definitively, or a few things that we can say with confidence, is that however we handle these concerns, it should not be motivated by fear. We shouldn't fear the way that the world fears. And so if the way that we think about dealing with the threat of violence is the same way that the world thinks about it, then there's probably a problem. We need not to fear the way that the world fears. God has not given us a spirit of fear, but rather he's given us a living hope. That we view death in a different way than the world does. It shouldn't be motivated by self-interest. It's not that we simply should be unwilling to suffer, or unwilling to be treated unjustly, or unwilling even to sacrifice ourselves if it means showing love and doing good and accomplishing some good purpose. It shouldn't be motivated by any personal animosity or vengeance. We're not to act in retaliation. Vengeance is the Lord's, and we need to leave room for wrath. And so if that's where we're coming from in discussing these things, then we need to stop. We need to check our hearts. We need to go back to what attitude and heart God would have us approach this from. But I do think there is a biblical principle of, in love and in a respect for the value and the sacredness of human life, that there may be times where even deadly force is appropriate in the defense of human life. Human life is sacred. We see that very early on in the scriptures. It belongs to God. It bears his image, and thus it ought to be protected. But if we are approaching the question with that heart, it doesn't automatically settle all the questions of self-defense. It doesn't automatically tell us exactly where we need to draw the line. There's still discernment and discretion that needs to happen of when that's appropriate or to what extent that is appropriate, when it's justified, when it's not justified for the purpose of defending human life. And so what I want us to ask tonight is, what guidance does the Scripture give us in answering those questions and helping us know where to draw some of those lines? So very briefly, I want us to look at some principles from the Old Testament, some examples from the Old Testament about self-defense, and also some examples and principles of self-defense in the New Testament. And if you are looking for a definitive answer on the questions of self-defense tonight, you're going to be disappointed by this sermon. I'm not going to tell you exactly where the line needs to be drawn. I'm not even going to tell you exactly how this congregation needs to handle the concern of a violent threat. I'm going to leave that to our shepherds. They're going to guide us in how we as a congregation are going to handle that. But I do hope to at least give you some biblical ideas to think about as you work through those questions, as we work through those questions together as a congregation. And so first of all, let's look at defending human life in the Old Testament. If you look at Exodus 22, in the law of Moses, in Exodus 22, verse 2 and 3, we read this. If the thief is caught while breaking in and is struck so that he dies, there will be no blood guiltiness on his account. But if the sun has risen on him, there will be blood guiltiness on his account. He shall surely make restitution. If he owns anything, then he shall be sold for his theft. Here, the law of Moses makes a clear distinction between when deadly force in the defense of one's household was justified and when it wasn't. And I want you to notice in the law of Moses what that distinction is. It's not a distinction between a difference in the act of the intruder. There's nothing about, if he does this or if he does that, he causes this much harm, or he broke in that way or this way, then it's justified. The only difference we see in Exodus 22 is a difference, I believe, in the clarity of intent, right? Where the light of day made it clear that this intruder's crimes threatened property, but were not a threat to human life, then deadly force was not justified against them. But where darkness of night might have obscured the exact nature of the threat to one's household, deadly force was justified in the defense of oneself and one's family. And so defending oneself with any amount of force in any context is not justified in the Old Testament. It's not just kind of a black and white, yes, you can use self-defense, and now in any situation, if we think that we're being threatened, it's okay for us to use any amount of force. It's not black and white like that, but there does seem to be, at least in the Old Testament, a point at which where the threat may in fact be against human life. We don't know the exact nature of this threat. Well, God provided a means where somebody would not be guilty of having shed blood if he is doing so where perhaps that intent was not clear. And so there is a time and a place where deadly force was lawful and accepted by the Lord in defense of one's household under the law of Moses. By the way, if you go back a chapter to Exodus 21, you'll see in verse 12 through 14 some laws about what we might call involuntary manslaughter. If somebody shed blood with prior intent and they were planning to do somebody harm, then they were going to be held accountable in that. But there were some cases, and he doesn't spell out what those cases might be, but there's some cases in which he says if God caused him to fall into your hands, then that's what cities of refuge were for. Right? So some cases, perhaps even a situation like this, Exodus 22, where somebody is killed in self-defense, well, God made a provision by which some death might occur without ill intent, without prior planning, without premeditated murder. And so in the Old Testament, there was a context in which defense, even using deadly force, was appropriate. Let's see some examples of that. Again, this is a shortened lesson, and so we're just going to look at a couple examples. But turn your Bibles with me to Nehemiah chapter 4. Nehemiah chapter 4. And you remember in the book of Nehemiah and his fellow citizens there in Jerusalem are working to rebuild the walls. And as they're rebuilding the walls, they encounter some opposition, even some death threats from the people of the land around them. And let's start reading in Nehemiah 4, verse 11. We'll just read through 15 here. Verse 11, our enemies said, they will not know or see until we have come among them, killed them, and put a stop to the work. When the Jews who lived near them came and told us 10 times, they will come up against us from every place where you may turn. Then I stationed men in the lowest parts of the space behind the wall, the exposed places, and I stationed the people and families with their swords, spears, and bows. When I saw their fear, I rose and spoke to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses. When our enemies heard that it was known to us, and that God had frustrated their plan, then all of us returned to the wall, each one to his work. If we continue to read, we see that even as they do the work, they continue to be girded with their weapons to carry it around. Some of them are carrying a weapon in one hand and doing the work with the other hand. And so here, we see that as they face this threat of death, they're told not to fear, just like we talked about this morning, right? They're not to fear the way that anybody else would fear. He says, remember the Lord who is great and awesome. Put your trust in the Lord. But even as he encourages them to put their trust in the Lord, he doesn't say, trust in the Lord, don't worry about it, just keep working. He says, trust in the Lord, and here's your sword, and here's your spear, and here's your bow, and let's make sure we station people at these proper places. It's not that they're fearing death or not trusting in the Lord, but they recognize that a means of deliverance is equipping themselves and trusting that God will help them. They're not going to stop the work. They're going to continue going, but they're going to trust that God will help them even through their own means of protection, equipping with swords and spears and bows, preparing to fight. And I want you to notice why. Why were they preparing to fight? Was this out of revenge or retaliation, simply out of personal self-interest and unwillingness to suffer? He says, fight for your families. Fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, your houses. Protect human life, right? And so, as we look through the book of Nehemiah, this is not presented to us as some negative example that these people weren't trusting the Lord, or these people weren't having the right heart towards their enemies. No, it's presented to us as a commendable thing of those who are courageous, who act in faith and pursuing God's will and work, even in the face of violent opposition. And you notice here as well, this is really kind of the ideal situation. By the very act of equipping themselves, they never have to use those weapons, right? The threat is kept at bay. They never actually employ violent force. I think that's the ideal situation, right? Where they equip themselves and yet it prevents violence. It prevents violence either towards them or towards somebody else. And that certainly is the ideal. We do see another situation in the book of Esther, in verse 10 and 11 here, where God's people do actually use the weapons. In the book of Esther, remember, you have the situation where Haman has concocted this plan to annihilate the Jews, and it's been put into a written law of the Persians. But then through Esther's intercession for her people, the Persians, the king makes an edict that they are now able to defend themselves. If we start reading in verse 10, it says, he wrote in the name of Ahasuerus and sealed it with the king's signet ring and sent letters by couriers on horses riding on steeds sired by the royal stud. In these letters, the king granted the Jews who were in each and every city the right to assemble and to defend their lives, and to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate the entire army of any people or province that might attack them, including children and women, and to plunder their spoil. This is slightly different than what we saw in Nehemiah. Here, God's people do actually end up using their weapons, but it was for the government-sanctioned purpose of defending human life, of defending their lives against any army that might choose to rise up against them, according to the previous government edict concocted by Haman. There's not a whole lot of divine commentary on this in the book of Esther. In fact, Esther is one of the very few, perhaps the only book in all the Bible that doesn't mention the name of God. But we see God at work in the background. And the Jewish people celebrated this deliverance year after year after year in the Feast of Purim as a deliverance by God, right? That God brought about this situation with Esther, that she was able to appeal, to work this out so that they could defend their lives against those who wanted to wipe them out. And so God is praised for his deliverance in this act, and yet it is deliverance through them taking up arms in defense of human life. This was not simply them taking matters into their own hands and defending themselves rather than trusting God. This was them taking advantage of the God-given means of deliverance that came through Esther's petition to the king of Persia. So in the Old Testament, I think we can see pretty clearly in the law of Moses and in multiple examples of deliverances that we would see as deliverances from God, this concept of defending human life, protecting innocent life through, yes, even the means of violent or deadly force. But the question we then have to address is, what about the New Testament? We aren't today part of a kingdom that conquers through sword and through military force. Jesus' kingdom under the new covenant is described in the prophets as a kingdom in which we're going to beat our swords into plowshares and our spears into pruning hooks, right? We see that in Isaiah 2 and in Micah 4. And so are the principles we've seen of defending human life in the Old Testament, are they reversed? Are they undone in the New Testament? As we saw this morning, clearly Jesus warns us against an attitude of retaliation, of taking judicial justice into our own hands, against an attitude of animosity or revenge. He teaches us to first pursue mercy and love towards those who would treat us unjustly, even those who would seek to harm us. But does that erase the principle of defending innocent life that we've seen already in the scriptures? Or does it maybe at least limit that defense to nonviolent means? Well, what do we see about defending human life in the New Testament? We could talk about a few things, but I'm really just going to look at one passage. And turn your Bibles with me to Luke 22. Luke 22. And start reading with me in verse 35. This is Jesus preparing his disciples for his departure. And in verse 35, it says, "And he said to them, when I sent you out without money belt and bag and sandals, did you not lack any? You did not lack anything, did you?" They said, "No, nothing." Verse 36, "And he said to them, but now whoever has a money belt is to take it along. Likewise also a bag, and whoever has no sword is to sell his coat and buy one. For I tell you that this which is written must be fulfilled in me. And he has numbered with the transgressors. For that which refers to me has its fulfillment." They said, "Lord, look, here are 2 swords. And he said to them, "It is enough." Okay, so here Jesus makes reference to having sent them out and preaching the gospel previously in what we sometimes call the limited commission. And when he sent them out, he didn't send them with provisions for their needs as they went to each city. Those who received their teaching would take them in, would provide for their needs. He says, "You remember that when I sent you out? Did you lack anything?" No. The people provided for their needs. He says, things are going to be a little bit different now. As I leave, you need to expect that you're going to be rejected, that you're going to be persecuted. You're not going to be able to go and preach and just assume that your needs are going to be provided for. He says, in some cases, you're going to need to prepare so that you're able to provide for yourself as you're out there preaching. And he says one other thing. He says, let him who doesn't have a sword sell his coat and buy one. Well, what does he mean by that? Why is he telling them to buy a sword now? It seems that as they are going out preaching and they're encountering this persecution, they're going to have a need to defend themselves, right? What other purpose is he telling them to buy a sword for? Unless it's just that they're going to need a really big letter opener, after Jesus is gone. It seems there is some context in which the use of force, of violent force, in protecting human life is going to be needed. And he said, they say, well, we have these 2 swords. And Jesus doesn't say, no, you guys, you misunderstood me. Don't actually get a sword. He says, it's enough. Okay? Now, obviously, this does not mean that any and every use of a sword is condoned. This does not mean that every act of persecution should be met with violent force. Obviously, that's not the case, right? Matthew 26, when Peter takes one of those swords and draws it out and cuts Malchus's ear off, Jesus says, put your sword back in its place. Those who take up the sword are going to perish by the sword, right? It's not that any and every use of that is appropriate and is okay. We shouldn't be the people who are eager to go to violent force, who are eager to take that out and use it. But Jesus didn't tell them to get rid of it. He said, take a sword. It seems there was a context and a place where they were going to need it. I think ideally, maybe like Nehemiah's situation, maybe the very fact that they have it is going to prevent violence from happening at all. I think that's the goal, right? And so they're not the ones who initiate violence. They're not the ones who retaliate in violence. But Jesus, it's hard to get around the fact that Jesus tells them to equip themselves with a weapon that was intended for the use of violent force to protect, I believe, human life. And so Jesus seems here to support the idea of fending off an attacker or preventing violence, protecting human life, which is precious and sacred in the eyes of God. Yes, even with the use of violent force. And so our goal as kingdom citizens, obviously we are to be peacemakers. We are to be the ones who, as much as depends on us, are pursuing peace. We are not the ones who initiate violence or are eager to use violence in any way. But if we, in some way, can prevent violence, can prevent the taking of further human life, not to escalate the situation, but to de-escalate it, to inflict as little damage as possible, it's hard to get around the fact that there may be an appropriate situation in which the use of a sword, the use of even a deadly weapon, was appropriate in defending human life. Again, more than anything, as we discern where that might be appropriate, where that might be necessary, where it may not, let's make sure that we have the heart of Jesus. That's not what anybody desires. That's not what we should desire. It shouldn't be motivated by fear. It shouldn't be motivated simply by self-interest. It shouldn't be motivated by vengeance or animosity. But if we can, in love, protect human life, then I believe there is a biblical case to be made for doing that. We should not be people who take any pleasure in violence. We should not be people who want to take vengeance or retaliation into our own hands. We should not be people who are unwilling to accept unjust treatment and persecution if it means an opportunity to show love. We're not people who at the first sign that we're feeling uncomfortable or threatened in a situation are immediately pulling out our sword like Peter, right? We should not be people who are unwilling even to die if it means showing the sacrificial love of Jesus and the living hope that we have as Christians. But biblically, it seems there may be some context in which it is appropriate for us to take up arms in defense of the innocent and the protection of human life. I think each individual is going to have to take those biblical principles and use some discernment and your own conscience and your own determination of where that may or may not be appropriate. I think each congregation is going to have to take those principles and make some decisions. Our elders are going to have to make some decisions about that. And they're going to talk about some decisions that they're making regarding security here. And I think we, as individuals, need to obey our leaders, right? And respect the choices that they make and what decisions we make here regarding security. Insofar as it doesn't violate our individual conscience. And if that's the case, we need to talk to them about that. But let's make sure that we're approaching it from a way that honors God first. Not just approaching it how I personally feel about it, right? But approaching it that we're genuinely trying to pursue the will of God, to have his heart. Well, we often end sermons with an invitation to respond to the gospel, to confess sin, to reach out for the prayers and support of brethren. That invitation really is not only applicable at the end of sermons, though. That invitation is always open. And I want us to make that very clear. We want to be supporting one another. We want to be encouraging one another. We want to be helping people in their relationship with the Lord. And so that invitation is available all the time, night or day. These people care about you. I care about you. And if there's any way that we can help you in your relationship with God, please reach out. And if at this time you recognize some area that we can help you in your relationship with the Lord, won't you let it be known by coming forward as we stand and sing together.